poor nurse removed 16 bullets from a stranger, not knowing. He was the mafia boss everyone feared. The night howled. Wind scraped down the alleyways, pushing waves of snow that swallowed everything but the flicker of tired street lamps. The last city bus screeched somewhere in the distance, then silence. Only the crunch of boots breaking fresh snow. Grace Miller pulled her coat tighter, breath clouding into the bitter air. She had just finished a 16-hour shift at the Dorchester Community Clinic. Her hands still smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Boston's old Port District was empty now, the kind of place where light hesitated to stay. Then she heard it. Soft, almost drowned by the wind. A sound halfway between a groan and a plea. She stopped. Her pulse quickened. The sound came again, from behind a pile of snow near the curb. Her flashlight sliced through the dark. The beam landed on a man sprawled on the ground, his black suit shredded, snow blooming red beneath him. "God," she whispered, dropping to her knees. "Hey, can you hear me?" His lips moved. The words came out in broken gasps. "Don't call the police. You're bleeding out," she stammered. "You need a hospital. If you do." His eyes flickered open, gray and fever bright. "We both die." Something in his tone, an authority born from violence, froze her. But he was human, bleeding, dying. The nurse in her overruled every instinct to run. She tugged her scarf free and pressed it against the worst wound, feeling hot blood soak through the wool. When her light caught his chest, her stomach lurched. Bullet holes, too many to count. She forced herself to count anyway. 1, 2, 10, 16. No one survived that. No one should. And yet his pulse, faint as a whisper, was still there. Grace looked around. The street was a wasteland. No help would come, and the man's eyes, half open, glassy with pain, were watching her like he already knew she wouldn't walk away. She slid her arms under his shoulders, breath ragged. He was heavy, the dead weight of someone whose body no longer remembered how to live. She dragged him, step by staggering step, down the block to her basement apartment. Inside, the single bulb flickered overhead, peeling paint, the smell of damp concrete. She cleared the small table she used for meals, rolled him onto it, and grabbed her worn first aid kit. The tools were old, the metal dull with age. Her hands shook as she sterilized what she could, boiled water on a rusted stove, lined up gauze and thread. When she cut through the fabric of his shirt, she stopped breathing. The sight was almost unreal. 16 bullet wounds across his torso and shoulder, some shallow, others deep enough to swallow her fingertip. "Please, stay with me," she whispered, though she doubted he could hear. Her fingers moved on instinct, forceps, pressure, stitch. Blood slicked the table, ran down her arms, the sound of metal against metal, the hiss of boiling water, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The first bullet came out with a wet click. He jerked, a groan tearing through his teeth. By the 8th, she was trembling so hard she had to bite her lip to stay focused. By the 13th, she thought he was gone, his skin turning the color of ash. "Not yet," she muttered, pressing on. "You don't get to die now." The 16th bullet clattered into the metal bowl. The sound rang through the room like a verdict. Then nothing. No pulse, no breath. His chest lay still. Grace froze. "No, no, no, please!" She pressed her palms to his chest, started compressions. 1, 2, 3. Her arms burned. Tears streaked down her face. She leaned down, breathed into his mouth again and again until the world shrank to the rhythm of her own sobs and the storm outside. For a long, terrible moment he was a statue carved from ice and silence. Then so faint she almost imagined it. A breath, a shallow rise under her hands. Another. Grace gasped, staring as his eyelids fluttered. He coughed, a weak, wet sound, but it was life. A laugh burst out of her, shaky and disbelieving. She pressed a towel against his chest, whispering through tears, "You're alive. Do you hear me? You're alive." Outside, the wind began to calm. Snow drifted against the window, soft and slow, as if the night itself had exhaled. Grace sat beside the blood-stained table, her hands still on the stranger's chest, the ghost of his heartbeat pulsing against her palm. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that the man she had just dragged back from the edge was the most feared crime lord in the city, the ghost king of the syndicate. All she knew was that against the cold and the darkness, she had stolen one fragile breath back from death, And somewhere, deep inside that breath, the story of both their lives had just begun. When Ethan woke, the first thing he felt was the cold. It crept up his spine, sank into his bones, and told him that somehow, against reason, he was still alive. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was cracked. The paint bubbled from damp. A single light bulb hummed. Somewhere, a radio played soft jazz through static, the tune warbling in and out of tune as if even the music was too tired to go on. He turned his head and saw her. The woman from the snowstorm sat slumped in a wooden chair beside the bed, her knees drawn close, head resting on her arm. Her hair had fallen loose from its tie. A few strands brushed against his hand where she'd fallen asleep. In her other hand, she still held a roll of gauze, as if she'd been fighting to stay awake until the last second. Ethan studied her face. It was soft, calm, not the face of someone who had ever known his world. He could smell antiseptic soap and faintly jasmine. His throat ached when he tried to speak. "Where am I?" he murmured, voice rough like gravel. Her eyes blinked open at the sound. For a moment, confusion, then relief. She leaned forward. "You're awake. God, you're awake." He tried to sit up, pain cutting through his ribs. "Don't move," she said quickly, pressing a hand against his shoulder. "You've lost too much blood." He stared at her, something dark flickering behind his eyes. "You shouldn't have helped me." She didn't flinch. "I'm a nurse. I don't choose who gets to live." For the first time in years, Ethan Cole didn't know what to say. Over the next few days, the rhythm of survival replaced fear. Grace changed his bandages twice a day, brewed ginger tea that filled the little basement with warmth, and read aloud from a water-stained paperback when the silence grew too heavy. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer answers. Sometimes she'd hum along with the radio, soft and off-key while she worked. Ethan would lie there, eyes half closed, listening to that fragile sound thread its way through the pain. It was the first human sound that didn't come with a demand or a threat. One night she fell asleep in the chair again. The air had grown cold. The small heater sputtered and died. Ethan pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, and pulled the thin blanket from his legs. He draped it over her shoulders. For a moment his fingers hovered above her hair, then he pulled back. The gesture was clumsy, almost uncertain, but it was the first kind thing his hands had done in years. Morning came with the smell of snow melting on the windowsill. Grace was pouring hot water over tea leaves when a sharp knock echoed through the small room. She froze. 3 knocks. Firm, measured. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The calm in his face turned to steel. "Don't say a word," he whispered. Grace's heart hammered. She watched as he pulled a pistol from under the pillow. She hadn't even noticed it there and aimed it at the door. Another knock, then a voice, low but respectful. "Boss?" Her eyes widened. "Boss?" Ethan sighed, lowering the gun slightly. "Open it," he said, voice flat. 2 men stepped inside, both in black coats dusted with snow. Between them stood a little girl clutching a worn teddy bear. Her hair curled around her cheeks, her eyes, gray like Ethan's, searched the room. The moment she saw Grace, she dropped the bear and ran straight to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. "Mommy," the girl breathed, pressing her face into Grace's coat. Grace froze. Ethan's knuckles went white around the edge of the bed. The faint scent of jasmine filled the air. He saw it in the way the child breathed her in, the recognition of something lost, the comfort of a smell that once meant home. Grace stammered, "Sweetheart, I think you—" But the little girl just held tighter. "Don't leave again." Ethan closed his eyes, every wall inside him cracking at once. He'd prepared for bullets, betrayal, blood. Not this. He looked at Grace, at the woman who had seen him broken and bleeding yet refused to run. For the first time, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a lifeline. "You'll stay," he said quietly. "You'll stay here, as my nurse, and for her." Grace met his gaze, unsure if she was agreeing or surrendering. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside that dim room, something new began. An uneasy truce between Mercy and the man who had never believed in it. Grace had never seen a house like this. The Cole estate rose from the hills outside the city, all glass and stone, immaculate lines cutting through the winter mist. It was beautiful in the way tombs are beautiful, precise, cold, made to last longer than the people inside them. When the black car stopped at the gates, armed guards stepped forward. No one spoke. One nodded and the gates opened without a sound. Grace held Emily's small hand, feeling the child tremble as they crossed into another world. Inside, the silence was heavier than the snow outside. The marble floors gleamed, gray upon gray. The walls bore no paintings, only mirrors that reflected emptiness. Even the staff moved like shadows, their black suits blending into the walls. Ethan walked ahead of them, straight back, despite the bandages hidden beneath his shirt. His voice carried through the hall without needing volume. "Follow the rules," he said simply, not turning around. "In this house, there are no mistakes." Grace frowned. "Rules?" He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, eyes unreadable. No colors, no laughter loud enough to echo, no mention of the dead. Her voice came out small. "Why? Because we survive by order, not by chaos." He started up the stairs, ending the conversation. They were shown to adjoining rooms, one for Grace, one for Emily. Grace unpacked what little she owned, a few dresses, her nurse's kit, a jar of jasmine oil, then wandered to the window. The garden outside was bare, branches like bones, snow lying untouched. The whole place looked like it was holding its breath. Dinner that evening was served in a dining room big enough to hold 20 people, though only 3 sat at the table. Ethan at the head, Grace and Emily to his right. The servants moved like ghosts, setting plates without meeting anyone's eyes. Emily's feet barely touched the floor. She clutched her spoon too tightly. Grace tried to smile at her, but the air was so tense it hurt to breathe. Then the girl's small hand trembled. The glass of water tipped, spilling across the white tablecloth. The sound was deafening. The servants froze. Ethan's gaze lifted slowly, icy and sharp. Emily's face drained of color, her lips quivered, eyes wide as if she'd just broken something sacred. Grace moved before she thought. She knelt beside the girl, grabbed a napkin, and began blotting the water. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said softly. "Everyone spills sometimes." No one breathed. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The staff stood rooted until he finally flicked his fingers, dismissing them. Dinner continued in brittle silence. Later, when the dishes were cleared and Emily had been tucked into bed, Grace found herself standing outside Ethan's study. Light spilled through the half-open door. Inside, he sat at a massive desk, papers spread out, the faint glow of a monitor painting his face pale. She took a breath and stepped in. "You scared her tonight." He didn't look up. "She has to learn. She's 5. 5 is old enough to understand the consequences." Grace folded her arms. "Consequences for spilling water? She thought you were going to hurt her." His pen paused mid-stroke. "I would never harm her. You don't have to. She's already afraid of you." That got his attention. His eyes lifted, gray steel meeting hers. "You think I don't know fear? This house runs on it. It's the only reason she's safe." "Safe?" Grace's voice rose. "She's a child living in a mausoleum. You can control your men, your business, maybe even this whole damned city. But you can't control how your daughter feels. You can't command her not to be scared of her own father." The words hung between them, fierce and trembling. Ethan stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. For a moment, Grace thought he might explode. Instead, he exhaled, long and low, like a man trying to remember how to breathe. "Go to bed, Miss Miller," he said finally. "You've done enough for tonight." She hesitated, heart pounding, then turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the empty hall. That night, Ethan didn't return to his desk. He stood by his daughter's door, watching the rise and fall of her breathing in the half-dark. Her teddy bear rested under her arm. Her lashes were still damp. For years, he'd faced death without blinking. But this small, fragile life that looked at him with fear was something he didn't know how to fight. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake. Ethan stayed there a long time, long enough for the first hint of dawn to lighten the windows. For the first time in years, he didn't think about his enemies or the Empire waiting for orders. He thought only of the sound of his daughter's steady breathing, and of the woman who had dared to raise her voice to him and made the silence of the house feel a little less absolute. The house began to breathe again, quietly at first, like something thawing under the snow. It started with color. One morning, the servants entered the dining hall and froze. On the long, pale table sat a plate of pancakes shaped like hearts. A few were uneven, one slightly burnt, but they smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. Foreign scents in a house that had long smelled only of polish and gun oil. At the far end of the table, Grace was standing on a stool, reaching for the top shelf. Her hair was tied up messily, flour dusted across her cheek. Emily, still in her pajamas, giggled as she tried to mimic the motion. When Ethan walked in, conversation stopped. His presence still carried gravity. Every servant straightened as if the air itself had snapped to attention. Grace turned, spatula in hand. "Good morning." He stared at the table, then at her. "What is this?" "Breakfast," she said simply. "Something other than coffee and silence." His brow furrowed. "This house has rules." "I know," she interrupted. "And maybe they're why your daughter barely smiles." He should have been furious. The room expected it. Instead, Ethan's gaze shifted to Emily. The little girl looked up at him with syrup on her chin, waiting. The anger that rose in his chest found nowhere to land. "Eat before it gets cold," Grace said softly, handing him a plate. He didn't sit at the head of the table that morning. He sat beside his daughter, and the days that followed were strange, almost dangerous in their simplicity. Grace took Emily to the garden every afternoon. The grass was patchy and the trees bare, but to the little girl, it was paradise. They planted marigold seeds in mismatched pots and named each one after stars. Grace taught her to hum while she worked, tiny off-key notes that floated up to Ethan's office window. At first, he tried to ignore it. He buried himself in files, meetings, numbers. But the laughter outside slipped through the cracks like sunlight under a door. One afternoon, he looked down from the balcony and saw them. Grace kneeling in the dirt, Emily painting streaks of color across a sheet hung between two trees. The wind caught it, and for a second it looked like the garden itself had learned to smile. Something loosened in his chest. That evening, when he came home, the smell of butter and sugar filled the kitchen. Grace and Emily were elbow-deep in dough, arguing cheerfully about the right amount of chocolate chips. He watched from the doorway unnoticed until Emily spotted him. "Daddy, help us." He almost said no, almost reminded her of the rules, but the word stuck in his throat when he saw her face, so bright, so expectant. He rolled up his sleeves. "Show me how." Grace handed him a wooden spoon. "Careful, boss. Kitchen work can be more dangerous than your meetings." He laughed, a real sound, awkward from disuse. For the first time in years, someone in that kitchen laughed with him instead of because of him. Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the garden, turning it into a canvas of white. One afternoon, Emily begged to play outside. Grace bundled her up in too many scarves, and soon the quiet courtyard echoed with shrieks of joy. Ethan stood at the window, watching them from inside until Grace waved at him, her gloved hand smudged with snow. "Come on," she mouthed. He hesitated. Then slowly he stepped out into the cold. They built a snowman together, Grace sculpting the face, Emily insisting on a crooked carrot nose. Ethan found himself laughing again when the whole thing toppled over, taking Grace with it. She landed on her back, laughing, cheeks flushed red from the cold. Emily squealed and threw a handful of snow that splattered right across Grace's face. "Traitor!" Grace gasped, scooping up snow in retaliation. She lunged but slipped on the ice. Before she could hit the ground, Ethan's arms caught her, the world still. She was pressed against him, her breath clouding between them, eyes wide. Snowflakes caught in her hair, melting into her skin. For a heartbeat too long, neither moved. He felt the rapid rhythm of her heart against his chest, real, wild, alive. The sound was louder than any gunfire he'd ever heard. "Careful," he murmured, voice low. "I don't want to have to save you." Her lips curved, a soft smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe next time I'll be the one saving you." A laugh broke from him, quiet but unguarded. Emily's laughter joined theirs, bright and echoing across the white yard. In that moment, surrounded by snow and fragile warmth, Ethan Cole, the man who had built an empire from fear, felt something he hadn't known he could feel again. Not power, not control, just the ache of wanting to stay. Inside the house, servants paused at the sound drifting through the walls, laughter clear and alive. It was the first real color the mansion had seen in years. But the quiet that Grace had brought into the Cole mansion began to unravel. It started with whispers. In the alleys near Boston Harbor, people spoke of a ghost walking again, of a man who'd survived 16 bullets and vanished into snow, of Ethan Cole, the Ghost King, back from the dead. Marcus Hale heard the story from one of his informants, a dock worker with trembling hands and too many reasons to lie. But the photo that came with it was proof enough. Ethan standing in a sunlit garden, his hand resting lightly on a woman's shoulder. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thin smile cutting across his face. "So that's your weakness," he murmured. "You finally found something to lose." He closed the laptop and began to plan. That same evening, Grace left the shelter after a long day. The winter air burned her lungs as she walked toward her car, the orange glow of the street lamps painting the snow gold. She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from the house, a message from Emily. "Can we bake cookies tomorrow?" She smiled, texting back quickly. "Of course, sweetheart. Go to bed early, okay?" Then a van slowed beside her. The tires hissed over ice. A door slid open, a hand shot out, grabbing her arm. The phone fell into the snow, the screen flashing once before it went dark. Her scream was swallowed by the wind. Back at the mansion, Emily waited by the window, tracing fog hearts on the glass. Grace had promised she'd be home by 8. It was past 10. Ethan stood in his office upstairs, pacing. Every minute without an answer tightened the vice in his chest. He called again. Voicemail. Downstairs, a soft sob carried through the hall. He found Emily curled on the couch, her teddy bear clutched against her chest. "She said she'd come back," the girl whispered. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan knelt, his heart splintering. "No, you did nothing wrong." "Then where is she?" He swallowed hard. "I'll find her. Promise?" He met her eyes. "On my life." Somewhere across the city, Grace woke to the sting of rope cutting into her wrists. A single bulb swung overhead. She was in a warehouse, the air thick with salt and rust. Marcus Hale stood in front of her, immaculate as ever, holding her phone between 2 fingers. "You're a brave woman," he said, voice slick with amusement. "But bravery gets people killed in my business." Grace spat blood from her lip. "You don't scare me." Marcus smiled. "Good. I'd hate for you to be boring. You're going to bring him to me, sweetheart. Or rather, he'll come running on his own." He dropped the phone into her lap, its screen lighting up with a single message already typed and sent. Unknown sender. "If you want her alive, come alone. Midnight. Southbridge Docks." At 11:45, Ethan's phone buzzed. The message glowed cold and taunting. The attached photo stole the air from his lungs. Grace, bruised and bound, eyes open but defiant. Rourke burst through the door moments later, breathless. "We traced the signal, Marcus Hale." Ethan's voice was low, steady, the kind of calm that made men afraid. "How many guards at Southbridge?" "Too many for one man," Rourke said. "Let us handle it." Ethan loaded a pistol, the metal clicking with finality. "He wants me alone. If any of you follow, he'll kill her." "That's suicide." Ethan looked up, eyes colder than the snow outside. "No, this is debt." Rourke hesitated. "What about your daughter?" "I already told her I'd bring Grace home," Ethan said, pulling on his coat. "I'm not breaking that promise." He walked past his men, past the portraits of ancestors who'd all built their power on blood. For once, he didn't feel like one of them. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes blurring the lights of the city. He paused at the gate, glancing back toward the windows of Emily's room. The glow of her nightlight shimmered faintly against the frost. "Stay asleep, little one," he whispered. Then he got in the car and drove toward the docks, the city falling away behind him. For years, Ethan Cole had fought to hold his throne. Tonight, he was fighting for something rarer, a reason to deserve being alive. The wind howled like a wounded animal. Southbridge docks lay under a bruised sky, the sea restless and black. Cargo containers loomed like silent giants, their metal walls groaning as the storm pressed in from the harbor. Every sound, the clang of chains, the low hum of cranes abandoned for the night, seemed to echo with menace. Headlights cut through the fog. Ethan's car rolled to a stop near the pier, engine idling. He stepped out alone, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. The gun tucked into his belt was his only companion. He looked around. Nothing. Then footsteps. From between the containers emerged Marcus Hale, his tailored coat whipping in the wind. The grin on his face was almost casual, as if he were greeting an old friend. "You should have stayed dead," Marcus called out. "Would have saved us both the trouble." Ethan's expression didn't change. "You talk too much." Marcus chuckled, drawing his pistol. "You always did. Funny thing, Power, it dies easier than people think. All it takes is one bullet. 16 didn't finish you, but tonight, I'll make sure." Ethan took a slow step forward, eyes sharp, voice low. 16 bullets didn't kill me because I finally had a reason not to die. Marcus cocked his head. The nurse, the girl in your house. His smile twisted. She's softer than your wife ever was. Something inside Ethan snapped. The wind roared as he drew his gun, firing the first shot. Metal rang. Sparks flew as a bullet ricocheted off the side of a container. Marcus dove behind cover, firing back. The air filled with the thunder of gunfire, flashes of light cutting through the fog. Ethan moved with precision born of years surviving ambushes, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. But Marcus was faster, fueled by rage and ambition. A bullet tore into Ethan's side. He staggered, one hand pressing to the wound, warmth spilling between his fingers. He ducked behind a crate, breath ragged, blood dripping onto the wet concrete. Across the dock, Marcus laughed. You're not the Ghost King anymore, Cole. You're just a man bleeding in the dark. Ethan gritted his teeth, voice rough. Then let's see which of us stays standing. He pushed off the crate, firing again. One shot grazed Marcus's arm. Another shattered the light above them, plunging the dock into a deeper shadow. Rain began to fall, cold, relentless. And then, over the sound of the storm, Ethan heard it, a cry. Grace. Her voice was faint but real somewhere behind the line of containers. He turned his head just enough to see her silhouette, bound, struggling against the ropes, her face pale but fierce. She'd freed one wrist, the ropes frayed from where she'd been working them against a rusted nail. Marcus noticed too. His grin widened. Looks like she saved me the trouble of finding bait. He raised his gun toward her. Ethan didn't think. He moved. The shot rang out, hitting him square in the abdomen. The impact knocked him backward. But before Marcus could fire again, Ethan squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark. Marcus staggered, eyes wide with shock, then crumpled to the ground. The echo of his fall was swallowed by the wind. Ethan dropped to one knee, vision blurring. His blood mixed with rainwater, swirling down the cracks in the dock. Grace was already there. She'd torn free of the ropes, running to him. Ethan, no, stay with me. He smiled faintly, the corners of his lips tinged red. You got out. You told me once to listen to my instincts, she said, pressing her hands over his wound. So I did. Now shut up and let me save you again. He tried to speak, but his voice came as a whisper. Not this time. Don't you dare, she snapped, tears mixing with rain. You hear me? I can't save you a second time, so please don't sleep. His gaze softened. If there's another life, I'd want to meet you before my hands ever touched blood. The world tilted. His head fell against her shoulder, his breath slowing. Then a blinding wash of lights. Sirens cut through the night. Black SUVs skidded into view, red and blue flashing across the water. FBI agents poured onto the dock, shouting orders. Grace turned, shielding Ethan's body from the chaos. Marcus lay motionless, his gun sliding into the tide. An agent knelt beside her. Ma'am, step back. He needs help, she cried. He's losing too much blood. Paramedics rushed forward. Ethan's eyes fluttered, catching hers one last time. You kept your promise, he murmured. So did you, she whispered. Then his eyelids closed, his body going still as they lifted him onto the stretcher. As the sirens wailed and the sea swallowed the last of the storm, Grace sat on the cold ground, his blood staining her hands. The Ghost King had come alone to die, but somewhere between bullets and vows he had learned how to live. The world came back to Ethan in fragments. Sound first, then light, then pain. A steady beep echoed somewhere near his head. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, mixed faintly with jasmine. When he opened his eyes, the ceiling above him was blindingly white. He turned his head and saw her. Grace sat slumped in a chair beside the hospital bed, her hair tangled, face pale with exhaustion. One of her hands rested on his, her fingers still curled protectively around his wrist. Dried blood, his, maybe hers, stained her sleeve. For a long moment he just watched her breathe. The lines of tension around her mouth had softened in sleep. It struck him in some quiet, unguarded way that she had stayed. Through the bullets, the fear, the chaos, she had stayed. His hand lifted almost without thought. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers trembling from weakness more than pain. She didn't stir. A smile ghosted across his lips. You should have run, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice a rasp. But I'm glad you didn't. The door creaked softly. A small figure peeked inside, Emily clutching her teddy bear. She hesitated, her wide gray eyes searching for permission. Ethan raised a finger to his lips and motioned her closer. The little girl padded silently to the bedside. For a heartbeat, she froze, then reached out and touched Grace's arm. "Is she sleeping?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "She's been taking care of us." Emily's eyes shone. Carefully, she climbed onto the bed, nestling against his side. Her head fit perfectly beneath his chin, her small hand curling over his heart. He wrapped an arm around her and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. 3 people, 3 broken halves that somehow fit. The machines hummed softly, a lullaby of their own. Grace stirred but didn't wake, her hand still locked in his. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of exhaustion finally settling over him. But it wasn't the heavy, haunted kind he knew too well. It was lighter, clean, human. He drifted in and out of dreams, where there were no gunshots, no blood, just laughter in the snow and the sound of Grace's voice calling Emily inside for dinner. When he woke again, sunlight was spilling through the blinds, painting everything gold. The storm outside had passed. Grace stirred with a soft groan and blinked her eyes open. When she realized he was awake, she straightened, brushing sleep from her face. "You're awake," she breathed, relief flooding her tone. He smiled faintly. "So are you. You should be resting." He studied her, voice low and teasing. "You first. You look worse than I do." Her lips curved despite herself. "Hardly possible. You were shot again." He chuckled, wincing at the pain. "I'm told I make bad habits out of near-death experiences." Grace shook her head. "You shouldn't joke about it. You scared us half to death." "Us?" She hesitated, then glanced toward Emily, still curled up asleep against him. "She refused to leave the hospital. Said she wouldn't sleep until she saw you open your eyes." Ethan looked down at the little girl, her hair falling across his chest, her breathing steady. His expression softened. "Looks like she kept her word." Grace followed his gaze, her own eyes misting. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hospital room seemed to shrink around them, holding only the sound of 3 steady heartbeats. "You should sleep," she said gently, breaking the silence. He smiled, voice a whisper. "No need. Someone already slept for me." Her breath caught, half a laugh, half a sob. "You always have to get the last word, don't you?" "Maybe," he said, eyes closing again, "but only when it makes you smile." She let out a soft laugh, the kind that didn't echo but lingered in the air. It felt foreign in that sterile room, real laughter, warm and alive. Emily stirred at the sound, murmured something incoherent, and pressed closer to them both. Ethan turned his head, meeting Grace's gaze one last time before drifting back to sleep. The lines of worry on his face eased, replaced by something rare, peace. The room, once filled with the steady hum of machines and the ghost of death, now held the simplest thing of all, the sound of quiet breathing and laughter shared between 3 souls who had finally found each other. And outside, beyond the hospital walls, the first sunlight of spring crept across the snow, melting what was left of the winter that had nearly taken them. 5 years later, the world had softened. The sea stretched wide and blue along the Italian coast, sunlight scattering diamonds across the waves. In a quiet fishing town near Amalfi, the smell of salt and warm bread filled the air. The streets were narrow and bright, lined with flower pots and laundry fluttering like prayer flags in the wind. At the corner of Via della Marina stood a small bakery with white shutters and a hand-painted sign that read, "Jasmine Crumb." Inside, the morning rush had just ended. The bell above the door chimed softly as Ethan Cole wiped his hands on his apron. The scar across his right palm caught the light. An old memory faded, but never forgotten. His hair had grown a little longer, silver glinting at the temples, but the edge in his eyes was gone. In its place was something gentler, something that looked suspiciously like peace. He leaned against the counter, watching as Grace carefully packed a box of biscotti for an elderly woman who came every week. Grace had changed too. The years had left traces of sun on her skin and laughter around her eyes. She worked at the town clinic 3 days a week, her patients paying in fruit, bread, or flowers. The rest of her time she spent here in the bakery, where the smell of jasmine and sugar mixed with sea air. "Grazie, dottore," the woman said, smiling as she left. Grace waved. "Prego, Signora Lucia, don't forget to take your medicine." When the door closed, Ethan chuckled. You realize you've become the town's favorite doctor, right? I'm starting to think they only buy bread to talk to you. Grace arched an eyebrow. Maybe they're just loyal customers. Or maybe they like your smile more than my croissants. She turned toward him, brushing flour from her fingers. Don't start a fight you can't win, Baker. He grinned, hands raised in surrender. From the courtyard outside came the sound of piano music, soft, lilting notes floating through the open window. Emily sat at the small wooden piano they'd found at a market 2 years ago, her hair tied in a messy braid, her fingers moving with practiced ease. She was 10 now, all freckles and confidence, the shy little girl from Boston long gone. She finished the song and looked up. Dad, Mom, did I mess up the ending again? Ethan stepped outside, wiping his hands. Sounded perfect to me. Grace followed, carrying a tray of cookies still warm from the oven. You'll melt every heart in this town if you keep practicing like that. Emily grinned, snagging a cookie. I learned from the best. The afternoon sunlight spilled over them as they sat together in the courtyard. The sea breeze fluttered the curtains. Somewhere nearby, a church bell chimed. Grace leaned back, closing her eyes. Hard to believe it's been 5 years. Ethan smiled, his voice quiet. Feels longer. Feels different. She turned to look at him. Do you ever miss it? The power? The control?